In Rome, a week of joy had a price, paid in slaves who were ordered to laugh, not metaphorically. The city staged reversals, exchanged gifts, and performed kindness like a costume. But the people without rights stayed exactly where they always were, inside the machine. So don't sell me the anagram. Don't hand me Santa il Satan like it's evidence. The real question is uglier, and it's the one history keeps trying to smother. When a society inherits a ritual it didn't design, who gets to steer it? And who profits when it becomes compulsory? Chronicles will call it tradition, but taxes, calendars, and logistics call it something else. Governance. Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Now, look closely at how the competitor script works. It opens with a cheap spell. Rearrange letters, whisper elite, and suddenly your childhood becomes a crime scene. That's not analysis. That's a shortcut, because real power doesn't need hidden demons. It prefers visible systems that look like normal life. It prefers a date that repeats, symbols that standardize emotion, and a social penalty for refusing to play along. And yes, December is a loaded month. Not because Earth becomes more receptive in some mystical way, but because pre-modern winter was a biology lesson written in hunger. The days shrank, the cold sharpened, food stores thinned, people died. The solstice was not poetry, it was a measurement of survival. If the light didn't return, everything collapsed. So, humans did what humans always do under fear. They built meaning on a schedule. They lit fires. They gathered. They sang. They made the darkness into a story they could live through. That's the first mechanism. You can govern fear by giving it a calendar. Then Rome enters the frame, because Rome was the empire that turned calendars into loudspeakers. Saturnalia wasn't Christmas, and we're not going to lie to you for drama. It didn't run neatly from the 17th to the 25th, the way viral scripts love to claim. But it did run in that same winter corridor, and it did normalize something essential. A society can blow off steam on command. A society can be told when to invert itself, when to forgive debts, when to hand out gifts, when to pretend hierarchy has melted, while slavery remains the foundation stone beneath the party. And when empires discover that trick, when they realize ritual can be engineered into obedience, they never stop using it. Sometimes it's a god, sometimes it's a bishop, sometimes it's a department store. The face changes, the function stays. We're going to walk this like a courtroom, not a seance. We'll separate Saturnalia from December 25th and show what Rome actually placed on that date later. The imperial sun language, the politics of unconquered rebirth. We'll track how Christianity inherited a world already trained to feel something at the darkest time of year, and why overwriting a ritual is easier than erasing it. Then we'll bring it home to the modern era, where the temple is retail, the hymn is a jingle, and the sacrifice is sleep, debt, and quiet resentment wrapped in red paper. Before we drag Rome into this, before we name Saturn or bishops or brands, you need to understand the oldest ingredient in the entire Christmas machine: winter fear. Not aesthetic winter, not cozy, the winter that kills. Imagine you live before electric light, before central heating, before supermarkets, before antibiotics. Your world is ruled by one brutal measurement: daylight. Every day after late summer, the sun slips away earlier. The cold doesn't arrive like weather, it arrives like a verdict. Food storage becomes arithmetic. How many mouths, how many sacks, how many weeks? And when the dark stretches, your nervous system doesn't debate philosophy. It does what bodies do under threat. It scans, it tightens, it remembers. This is why the solstice matters across cultures. Not because Earth is farthest from the sun in December. Astronomically, that's not how seasons work. Seasons are driven by the tilt of Earth's axis. But the lived experience is the same. The sun is low, the day is short, the night is long, and the human animal reads that as danger. So people did something that looks like spirituality, but behaves like logistics. They synchronized. You can hear the bones of the competitor script under the myth. Every December, you change. You feel nostalgic. You spend money you didn't plan. You reconnect. That part is real, not because an elite casts a spell, but because seasonal cues and social calendars pile weight onto the same narrow corridor of time. Your body learns the pattern. Your memory learns the pattern. The culture reinforces it until it becomes automatic. Rituals work through repetition plus symbolism plus emotion. That sentence is not occult. It's basic human conditioning. Do something once and you call it an event. Do it every year and it becomes identity. Add a chorus of songs, a smell, a specific color palette, and you don't just remember a season, you re-enter it. Your mind doesn't file it like a document. It replays it like a room you can still walk into. And that's where the dark origin actually lives. Not in demons, but in design that doesn't require consent. Because rituals don't ask you whether you want to feel them. They simply arrive. Stores change their lighting. Streets change their sound. Workplaces change their expectations. Families resurrect their scripts. The same movies, the same melodies, the same jokes, the same arguments, the same pressure to perform togetherness, whether or not your life can afford it. Now, pause on something the competitor script accidentally confesses. Your body responds to what you do, not what you believe. You can be an atheist and still feel your throat tighten when a certain song hits. You can reject religion and still get pulled by obligation. That's not proof of ancient technology, and it's proof of a very old truth. Humans are programmable through repetition, and the deepest programs are the ones installed before you had language to resist them. Here's the horrifying part, and I don't say that for drama. I say it because it's the moral spine of this series. The holiday spirit is often a socially acceptable mask for mass vulnerability. December is when loneliness becomes loud, because the culture insists on togetherness. December is when guilt spikes, because giving is treated like proof you love. December is when childhood is weaponized, not by a secret priesthood, but by the ordinary fact that memory is emotional. You smell pine, you see lights, and your adult brain briefly shares the steering wheel with a 5-year-old version of you who thought magic was real and love was something you earned by being good. And this is where the Santa mythology becomes less cute, even before we trace its actual history. A story built around surveillance and reward is not neutral. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. That isn't Satan. That is a training wheel for external judgment. Behave because you are watched. Obey because you are scored. Don't call it evil. Call it what it is. An early lesson in how societies stabilize behavior through imagined oversight. But we're still not at the center of the machine. Winter Fear explains why humans build rituals. It does not explain why certain rituals become permanent, standardized, and defended like law. For that, you need institutions. Because the solstice is a blank check. Anyone can write on it. A tribe writes survival. An empire writes loyalty. A church writes salvation. A corporation writes consumption. And the most successful version is the one that convinces you it was always there. So, you stop asking who picked the date, who funded the symbols, who benefits from the obedience. That's the pivot we're about to make. In the next part, we step into Rome. Not the Rome of marble postcards, but the Rome of bodies counted as property. We'll look at the winter festival people love to cite, separate what is true from what is viral, and ask the question polite history avoids. When an empire gives you a licensed week of joy, what is it buying from you the other 51 weeks? Rome loved to call itself civilized. It carved law into stone, measured land in straight lines, and built roads so perfect they still scar the earth. But if you want to understand what Rome really mastered, don't start with arches. Start with permission. The kind of permission a state grants when it wants you to believe cruelty is normal. Because cruelty, when scheduled, becomes culture. Saturnalia is usually sold as the fun fact in this story. A Roman party, a week of chaos, the ancient prototype of Christmas. That's the viral version. The real version is less convenient and more revealing. First, the dates. Saturnalia begins on December 17th and, in its classic form, runs through the 23rd. People love extending it to the 25th because it makes the narrative tidy. But history doesn't care about your tidy. Saturnalia occupies the same winter corridor, yes. It trains the same human instincts. Gather, feast, give, forget the darkness for a moment. But it is not Rome celebrating Christmas. It is Rome doing what empires do, managing pressure. And pressure is the key word. Rome was a society that ran on conquest and labor extraction. Its economy, its farms, workshops, households, even its status games, depended on enslaved people. That means the Roman winter wasn't only cold, it was claustrophobic. Everyone is indoors. Everyone is close. Tempers rise. Supplies run low. A rigid hierarchy under stress starts to crack. The state doesn't just fear external enemies, it fears internal rupture. So Saturnalia becomes a valve. The city flips the script, but only in ways that keep the foundation intact. Gifts are exchanged, feasts expand, gambling becomes tolerated. People wear caps associated with freedom. The language of equality is performed loudly for a short, sanctioned period. Masters might serve slaves at a meal. Slaves might be allowed to speak more freely. The world is inverted, on schedule. That sounds generous until you read it, the way a ruler would read it. Because inversion is not liberation. Inversion is theater. It's the empire saying, "We control even your rebellion. We will decide when hierarchy can pretend to loosen, We will decide when the poor can laugh at the rich. We will decide when the enslaved can taste the illusion of reversal. So, they return to the real order without burning the house down. That's the horror that survives beneath the candles. A modern audience hears, "Masters served slaves for a day," and imagines a cute roleplay. Rome's enslaved population didn't experience that as cute. If you live under ownership, a day of pretend kindness doesn't erase the other 364 days of coercion. It can even sharpen the cruelty, because it teaches you what mercy looks like, without granting you the power to demand it. Saturnalia, in that sense, is not a holiday. It's a demonstration. The state can grant you a simulation of freedom while keeping the receipt to prove it can revoke it. And here's the part the competitor script keeps missing because it wants the story to be occult rather than political. The darkness of Saturnalia is not that people decorated with greenery or exchanged gifts. The darkness is that the celebration was built inside a society where human beings were tools. The party runs on an invisible workforce. Someone cooks, someone cleans, someone serves, someone is not allowed to leave. If you want to talk about ritual control, start there. The empire didn't control the masses with secret symbols. It controlled them with property law and violence. And then it offered festivals to make that control feel survivable. Saturnalia also teaches another lesson power never forgets. Synchronized emotion is leverage. When everyone feasts at the same time, the state can track supply, movement, and mood. When everyone gathers, authority can be seen. When everyone participates, refusal becomes suspicious. Ritual doesn't need to be mystical to be effective. It only needs to be common. So no, Saturnalia is not Christmas with a different name. But it is a predecessor in a more important sense. It shows how a state can schedule feeling, and how a society can learn to call that schedule tradition. And then there's the other Roman piece, that the viral scripts scramble together with Saturnalia to make their dates line up. December 25th. Rome did put meaning on that day, but it wasn't Saturnalia's meaning. It was something sharper, more explicitly imperial, a narrative of rebirth and victory, language that can be aimed like a weapon at a population that's tired, cold, and ready to believe the next story that promises light. That's the turn. Because once you see Saturnalia as a pressure valve, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the empire can grant you a licensed week of laughter, what is it trying to purchase from you the other 51 weeks? And when Rome later elevates December 25th with the imagery of an unconquered sun, what kind of loyalty is that date designed to manufacture? In the next part, we leave the party and walk into propaganda. We follow the calendar as a tool of rule, and we watch Rome do what every durable power structure does: take a natural fear of darkness and turn it into a public religion of obedience. A festival like Saturnalia is how you manage pressure, but December 24th is how you manage meaning. This is where the viral story usually cheats. It drags Saturnalia forward to the 25th, waves at a vague pagan birthday of Saturn, then slaps the sticker rebrand on it and calls the case closed. That's not history. That's lazy storytelling. Rome didn't need sloppy. Rome did something cleaner. It used the calendar like a public address system. By the late Empire, Rome is not a city that can rely on personal loyalty. It's too big, too diverse, too tired. It's running on taxation, bureaucrats, and the brittle promise that the center still holds. When an empire reaches that stage, it has a recurring problem. How do you convince millions of people, many of whom will never see the emperor, that the order is still sacred? You don't solve that with speeches. You solve it with dates. A date repeats. A date makes itself true through return. A date doesn't argue with you. It just arrives, and it arrives with a script. And Rome understood something modern marketers still worship. If you can own the meaning of a season, you don't have to police every mind individually. You just have to flood the environment. So now we talk about the sun language that gets attached to late December. Not the sun as science, the sun as politics. The sun as the perfect symbol for a state that wants to sound eternal. Because the sun returns is a story no one can fact-check emotionally. People can be starving and still believe in light. People can be grieving and still crave a rebirth narrative. And in winter, when bodies are tense and the world feels smaller, rebirth is not abstract. It's a promise you can feel in your bones. Rome takes that promise and pushes it through power. December 25th becomes a stage for an imperial story, the unconquered, undefeated, returning light. The point isn't theology. The point is stability. A population that believes the world is turning toward light is easier to govern than a population that believes darkness is permanent. A population that expects renewal is easier to tax than one that expects collapse. That's why empires love rebirth. It's obedience with hope attached. And this is where your big question sharpens. Because now we can see the mechanism evolving. Saturnalia is the valve, controlled chaos that lets the system breathe. December 25th becomes the broadcast, controlled meaning that tells the system what it is. If you're looking for ancient technology, stop staring at symbols and start staring at administration. The technology is not mystical, it's institutional. Rome is refining a method. Synchronize emotion, then attach it to authority. Give the people a turning point in the year, then tell them whose victory that turning point represents. Now, does that mean Christmas is Sol Invictus with Jesus painted over it? Not that simple. History almost never gives you a single clean swap. What it gives you is overlap. Old habits, new language, competing meanings, all fighting for the same calendar real estate. That's the reality in late antiquity. A world where people don't switch beliefs like flipping a light. They layer them. They negotiate them. They keep some rituals because their grandparents did. They adopt new ones because the state rewards it. They blend because it makes life easier. And life, in that era, is already hard enough. This is where I want you to notice something uncomfortable. A ritual doesn't need to be true to be effective. It needs to be shared. The empire doesn't require every citizen to understand doctrine. It requires that citizens move together, feel together, and treat the same dates as meaningful. Once that happens, the state can ride the wave. That wave shows up as public events, sanctioned gatherings, official language, and the subtle punishment of standing apart. You don't have to be arrested to be controlled. Sometimes it's enough that opting out makes you socially visible. And social visibility is dangerous in a surveillance society, even before cameras exist. So when the competitor script tells you they designed this to control your subconscious, it's accidentally pointing at a real truth while missing the real culprit. The culprit isn't a secret priesthood hiding runes in a tree. The culprit is a system that learns to make participation feel like innocence, and refusal feel like betrayal. That's why this matters. Because now we're approaching the moment when Christianity enters not as a pure spiritual revolution, but as a movement trying to survive inside an imperial world that already knows how to weaponize dates. And Christianity faces a brutal strategic problem. It is expanding among people who are already trained to feel something in late December. The solstice corridor is already emotionally occupied. The infrastructure is already built, by fear, by habit, by the state's calendar. So the question is no longer, did Christians steal a pagan holiday? That's a cheap debate designed to keep you entertained. The real question, the one that answers our big question, is this. When a ritual is already running, does a new religion gain power by erasing it, or by inheriting it? Because inheritance is how systems survive. And if you wanted to understand how December becomes a permanent engine, rather than a temporary party, you have to watch the next move, the overwrite. In the next part, we step into the church's hard problem. Not conspiracy, not anagrams, strategy. A fight over the meaning of the darkest week, where the prize isn't truth, but the right to define what the light returning is supposed to mean. And who gets to stand at the center of that meaning? If you want a clean villain, history will disappoint you. The early church did not sit in a candlelit basement plotting how to program your subconscious. It did something more ordinary and more powerful. It solved a conversion problem with the tools every durable institution uses. Here is the problem, stated without romance. You can preach a new faith. You can argue doctrine. You can write gospels and letters and creeds. But you cannot walk into a population that has been trained, by winter, by habit, by the state, to treat late December as emotionally significant, and simply tell them, stop feeling that. Because they won't. Not because they're stupid. Because ritual is not primarily an idea. It's a bodily agreement, a schedule of gathering, a season of shared food, a time when the air itself tells you to slow down, to light something, to hold your children closer, to beg for more light. That corridor already belonged to something older than Christianity, the human need to survive darkness together. So the church inherits a choice that every rising power structure faces. Do you try to erase the existing ritual and create resistance? Or do you overwrite it and create continuity? Erasure is expensive. Overwrite is efficient. This is the part where cheap internet scripts scream, they stole it, as if theft is the whole story. But the deeper story is institutional strategy. When a religion spreads across an empire, it has to deal with the empire's calendar the way an army has to deal with terrain. You don't get to pretend the mountains aren't there. You don't get to pretend the rivers won't block you. You plan around them. You use them. You build bridges where the ground allows. Late December is one of those mountains. The Bible does not give you a birth date for Jesus. That's not controversial. It's simply what the texts are. Later Christians argued and calculated and speculated. Some proposed spring. Some proposed other seasons. But as Christianity becomes public, legal, and then dominant, the question stops being what is the most historically precise date, and becomes something colder. What date will actually hold the population? And that's where overwriting becomes not a conspiracy, but a political technology. Because look at what the overwrite accomplishes in one stroke. If you place Christ's birth in the solstice corridor, you claim the most psychologically loaded time of the year. You take the human fear of darkness and attach it to your theology. You take the language of returning light and make it a sermon. You take a date already saturated with communal momentum, and you redirect that momentum toward your institutions, your churches, your bishops, your rituals, your authority. The competitor script calls this frequency engineering. That's childish. The adult word is governance. Ritual governance works because it doesn't feel like governance. It feels like meaning. And the church is uniquely suited to this because it specializes in repetition. Weekly gatherings, seasonal fasts, feast days, public readings, shared songs. The same story told until it becomes an internal clock. This is not mystical control. It's social architecture. If you can standardize what a population does with their bodies, where they go, when they gather, what they sing, what they confess, you don't need to hunt for heresy in every home. You have built a habit that reproduces itself. Now, be careful here. This is where honest history refuses to be neat. There isn't one signed memo that says, "We pick December 25th to crush paganism." The motivations are argued and debated, and multiple explanations exist. But the functional reality remains. By the time December 24th is widely recognized as Christmas in the Christian world, the Church has achieved something empires envy. It has tied a universal seasonal threshold to a sacred narrative. And once that happens, the ritual becomes harder to dislodge than any individual belief. Because you can change your mind privately. You cannot easily change the calendar publicly. The calendar is collective. It's enforced by coordination. You don't get off the schedule without paying a social price. That's the part the competitor is touching without understanding. They point at how December makes you feel, and then they blame hidden occultists. But the reason December makes you feel is because you are swimming inside an inherited public system. Family expectations, work shutdowns, school breaks, liturgical cycles, state holidays, commercial schedules. It's a web so thick it masquerades as nature. And here's the monstrous beauty of overwriting. It allows power to appear gentle. It doesn't need to ban the human need for winter gathering. It can bless it. It can rename it. It can baptize the instinct. So the instinct starts defending the institution. People don't just obey. They protect the ritual. They police each other. They shame outsiders. They call dissent cynicism. They call refusal Grinch. They call questions ruining the magic. That is not supernatural. That is a society enforcing participation because participation feels like belonging. So the Church's hard problem is solved. But it creates a new one. Because when you inherit a ritual, you inherit its shadow. You inherit the old emotional logic. Darkness, fear, longing, return. And once you attach your God to that logic, you create a permanent lever. Every winter, the lever is pulled again. Every year, the population rehearses the same sequence: vulnerability, gathering, meaning, relief. And whoever controls the meaning controls the relief. Now ask yourself the big question again, sharper than before. When a society inherits a ritual it didn't design, who steers it? and who profits when it becomes compulsory. Rome profited in stability. The Church profited in unity and authority. But the story still isn't complete, because a ritual can govern emotion without governing behavior. To convert feeling into obedience, you need something even more practical, a standardized machine of repetition. In the next part, we follow that machine into its most disciplined form, Mass. Not as Christ Mass trivia, but as an apparatus that turns seasonal longing into official feeling, year after year, until the ritual is no longer a choice you make. It's a normal you live inside. The competitor script wants you hypnotized by words. Christmas, Christ, Mass. It treats etymology like a spell book, as if naming the mechanism is the same as proving a conspiracy. But the word is only the doorway. The machine is what happens behind it. Mass is not a vibe. Mass is a schedule. And schedules are how institutions turn private belief into public behavior. If you want to understand how late December stops being a loose seasonal impulse and becomes a standardized social event, look at what the Church perfects better than any empire before it. Repeatable, portable ritual. A format you can export. A script you can copy. A calendar you can enforce. That is the real technology. A weekly gathering may look harmless. People singing, kneeling, sharing bread and wine. But from the perspective of power, it is an administrative miracle. It trains bodies to move together. It trains minds to absorb a common narrative. It trains guilt and relief to arrive on cue. And it builds a public record of belonging. Who attends, who doesn't, who is visible, who is absent. In a world where rulers struggle to monitor distant provinces, the Church offers a distributed network of local centers. Each one produces the same thing: coordinated emotion. That emotion is not merely spiritual, it's social glue. It creates a population that shares a vocabulary of meaning, and shared vocabulary is the first step toward shared obedience. Now place Christmas into that system, and you understand why this date holds. Not because it's the true birthday, not because of an occult frequency, because the Church can turn seasonal fear into ritual obligation, and ritual obligation into identity. Here's how it works, and it's almost insultingly simple. First, repetition. The same story told annually and weekly and daily in prayers, until it becomes the default narrative through which people interpret the world. Second, symbolism. Not secret symbols, public ones. Light in darkness, a child, a mother, a stable, gifts, angels, a cosmic promise placed into domestic imagery. Symbols that bypass debate because they don't ask to be argued with, they ask to be felt. Third, emotional cadence. The liturgical year doesn't just tell you what to believe, it tells you when to feel. Anticipation, preparation, feast, reflection, then back into ordinary time. This is not mind control, it's mood governance. And mood governance is enough, because mood changes behavior without requiring you to admit you were influenced. This is where the viral scripts accidentally confess a real truth. You don't need faith for ritual to work, you just need participation. Even if you reject theology, you still experience the environment. Songs, gatherings, food, social expectation. The ritual can outlive belief because the ritual is carried by habit. A belief is an idea. A habit is a structure. And structures persist because they make life predictable. But predictability comes at a price: the right to opt out. Once a ritual is standardized, refusal stops being a private decision and becomes a public signal. You are no longer not celebrating. You are not participating. And in human groups, non-participation is read as threat. It makes people uneasy. It forces them to ask, if you don't join us, what are you judging? What are you refusing to affirm? Why are you outside? That social penalty is one of the most effective enforcement tools ever invented, because it doesn't look like enforcement. It looks like family disappointment, workplace awkwardness, friends calling you negative, the polite violence of being labeled ungrateful. So, yes, Christmas becomes an annual ritual with institutional power, but it doesn't become powerful by hiding its motives. It becomes powerful by becoming normal. Normal is the perfect disguise for control, and this is where the story gets uglier than the competitor's fantasy. Because when you combine institutional repetition with the winter corridor of vulnerability, you get a system that can reach the softest parts of a person, the parts formed in childhood, without asking permission. A child doesn't just learn about Christmas. A child is imprinted. A child hears the same songs before they can interpret lyrics. A child associates warmth with compliance. Be good, get gifts. Be difficult, lose the magic. The competitor script dramatizes this with Santa's surveillance. But the deeper truth is broader. The entire season becomes a training ground for external validation. Approval is performed, rewarded, witnessed. Disapproval is hinted, feared, remembered. And once you're trained to fear being the problem during a sacred season, you become easier to steer for the rest of the year. Not because you believe in Santa forever, because you've rehearsed the feeling of being watched, scored, and socially judged. That's the part we can say out loud without turning into a conspiracy cult. The season teaches compliance by wrapping it in beauty. Now, we've traced the institution. We've traced the schedule. We've traced the mechanism by which December becomes official feeling. But our big question still has teeth. Who steers it, and who profits when it becomes compulsory? So far, the answer has been empires profit in stability, and churches profit in unity. But the story isn't finished, because nothing in human history stays pure. Rituals migrate. They get repackaged. They get commercialized. They get weaponized in new ways. And to understand the modern machine, we have to build the bridge between moral authority and cultural authority, between bishops and brands. We need to talk about Santa, not as Satan, not as an anagram, but as an artifact. A figure assembled over centuries and then mass-produced into a moral technology for children. In the next part, we put the Santa story on the autopsy table. We trace what's historically true, what's folklore, what's modern packaging, and why the list matters more than the red suit ever did. Let's bury the anagram properly. Santa, Chol, Satan is not a revelation. It's a party trick that survives because it feels forbidden. But Santa's real origin is more interesting and more unsettling because it's not supernatural. It's historical assembly, a figure built in layers, a saint, a folkloric gift bringer, a winter judge, and finally a mass-produced mascot that teaches children how authority works. Start with what's real. There was a Christian bishop remembered as Nicholas of Myra, associated with generosity and gift-giving traditions. Over centuries, local winter customs across Europe fold into that story. The timing, the visits, the moral lessons. Different regions keep different masks, but the function stays recognizable. A figure arrives in winter, evaluates behavior, and distributes reward. Now watch what happens when that moral folktale meets modern society. A pre-modern village uses winter gift bringers to enforce community norms because it has limited tools: shame, praise, stories. But an industrial society can do more than reinforce norms. It can monetize them. It can print them. It can ship them. It can turn them into a seasonal operating system. That's what Santa becomes. Not pagan occult, not satanic inversion, but a portable surveillance fable packaged as warmth. Look at the structure, not the costume. A child is told there is an all-seeing figure who monitors them year-round. The child is told their behavior is recorded. The child is told rewards arrive from above based on compliance. That is not an abstract lesson. It's a behavioral template. You are observed, you are scored, you are paid in objects. And the genius, if you want to call it genius, is that the story trains obedience without visible coercion. No prison, no police, no courtroom. Just anticipation, fear of disappointment, and the glowing promise that good children receive more. The competitor script screams conditioning, and for once it stumbles into something true, then ruins it by invoking demons. Conditioning is real, but the conditioning doesn't require a cabal. It requires something simpler, a society that confuses morality with performance. Because Santa doesn't ask children to become ethical in the dark. He asks them to be good under observation. He doesn't teach internal conscience. He trains external evaluation. He doesn't say, do the right thing because it's right. He says, do the right thing because someone is watching and will pay you. That's a philosophy of power reduced into a bedtime story. Now add the crucial layer. Santa is collective. Every adult becomes an accomplice. Parents, teachers, relatives. Everyone plays the part. The child learns the deepest lesson not from Santa, but from the adult's agreement. The system is real because everyone acts like it's real. That's how institutions stabilize. Not by force alone, but by normalizing participation until refusal becomes socially unacceptable. And then comes the pivot that makes Santa uniquely useful to modern power. The child eventually learns Santa isn't real. At first glance, that should break the spell. But it often does the opposite, because the emotional imprint remains. The child doesn't simply stop believing, the child graduates. The authority figure changes costume. Santa becomes God in some households, still watching, still judging, still rewarding. In secular households, Santa becomes the school system, the employer, the algorithm. Not identical, not interchangeable, but familiar in shape. Your worth is tracked, your performance is scored, your access to rewards depends on compliance. The structure stays. The mascot is replaced. This is where the story stops being about Christmas and becomes about political psychology. Power does not begin by demanding your love. It begins by shaping your expectations. That judgment is normal, that surveillance is protective, that rewards are earned through obedience, that visibility is safety. And Santa is perfect for that, because he arrives wrapped in comfort. It's not a soldier at the door. It's a laugh, a song, a red suit, a myth that turns discipline into something a child looks forward to. That is what mature propaganda tries to do, make control feel like her. Now, to be fair, Santa can also carry genuine tenderness. Families use the season to express love. People give, not because they're coerced, but because they want to. The human desire to soften winter is real. But the machine doesn't care about your intent. A system can feed on sincerity as easily as on fear. It can take your love and root it through purchase, performance, and public display. And that's the modern turn. Because once Santa is standardized, once the imagery is everywhere, once the music is everywhere, once the narrative is everywhere, the question becomes less moral and more logistical. Who funds the saturation? Who decides which version of the myth gets broadcast? Who benefits when being good become buying enough? This is where the church's ritual engine meets the market's engine. One built habits, the other learned to harvest them. Santa becomes the bridge between institutional discipline and commercial extraction, the judge who not only measures you, but makes you want the reward to be physical, countable, and wrapped. And when a society teaches children that love arrives in objects, it shouldn't be surprised when adults measure devotion in spending. So no, Santa is not Satan. That's a distraction designed to make you feel like you uncovered a secret. The real secret is painfully obvious. Santa is a lesson in how systems install obedience through beauty and repetition, which raises the next question we can't avoid. If the moral architecture was built by ritual and story, who took it over at scale when factories, advertising, and debt arrived? In the next part, we leave mythology and enter infrastructure. Department stores, mass production, shipping schedules, seasonal labor, and the economic fact that modern Christmas isn't merely celebrated, it's manufactured, timed, and sold like a product launch. And we'll ask the most brutal question yet. When joy becomes an industry, who pays the human cost of keeping it believable? If Rome used the calendar to stabilize an empire, and the church used ritual to standardize feeling, modern capitalism did the final thing every power structure dreams of. It made the ritual profitable at industrial scale. This is where Christmas stops being a story you tell and becomes a machine that tells you what to do through supply chains, advertising budgets, and the quiet violence of debt. The competitor script throws out a dramatic number. Retail makes 30 to 40% of annual revenue in November and December, because big numbers feel like destiny. The cleaner truth is less cinematic, but still damning. In the US, holiday sales in November and December are commonly around a fifth of annual retail sales, not a third or half. That doesn't weaken the argument. It makes it credible, because you don't need apocalypse-level percentages for the incentives to be brutal. A system that earns 18 to 20% of its year in a short corridor will fight to keep that corridor emotionally compulsory. Now, look at what that corridor requires. Christmas is not one day. It's months of ramp-up, music starting too early, decorations appearing before you're ready, Ads that don't ask if you want to participate, they assume you do. That's not because the elite are occult engineers. It's because a seasonal profit window demands a long runway. You can't drain wallets in a week. You need a culture warmed up, pre-loaded, softened. So the market does what the church did. Without admitting it learned the method, it repeats, it standardizes, it floods the environment with symbols until your personal resistance feels like standing still in a river. Department stores in the modern era didn't just sell goods, they sold an experience. A controlled interior winter, lights, scents, displays, music, wonder. A secular cathedral where consumption feels like belonging. The child doesn't merely see Santa. The child sees Santa in a place designed to convert desire into purchase with minimal friction. And the adult? The adult is where the horror concentrates, because adults are taught to treat love as proof. Proof requires visible evidence. Evidence costs money. Money, for many people, is tight. So the season doesn't simply encourage generosity. It weaponizes comparison. It pulls family history into the checkout line. It makes you feel like a bad son, a bad mother, a bad partner if your gifts don't match the performance expected of you. That's not spirituality. That's tribute dressed as cheer. And tribute requires labor. Every December, the ritual is kept believable by human bodies. Retail workers standing for hours, seasonal workers moving boxes, delivery drivers racing against exhaustion, warehouse pickers measured by quotas that treat a person like a machine with a pulse. The customer sees a package arrive like magic. The system hides the bruises, the strained backs, the missed dinners. This is the modern equivalent of the invisible workforce under Saturnalia's banquet. The decor is different. The structure is the same. Someone else absorbs the cost, so the celebration feels effortless. Now add the mechanism the competitor script gestures at, but doesn't understand. Shame. Shame is how you enforce participation without law. You don't need police to make people spend. You need a culture that equates refusal with coldness. You're not doing gifts. You're not coming to dinner. You're not decorating. The questions sound polite, but they contain a threat. Opt out, and you will be marked as less human. That's why the ritual spreads through families like a script. Adults reenact what was done to them, partly out of love, partly out of fear of being the one who breaks continuity. The market exploits that fear. It sells you tradition in pre-packaged form so you don't have to invent meaning yourself. Wrapping paper, matching pajamas, ornaments, curated playlists, photo backdrops, identity kits. Because the hardest work is not buying, it's making your life feel coherent. The market offers coherence for a price. And here is the confrontation that makes people uncomfortable. Christmas doesn't control you because it's ancient. It controls you because it's socially enforced and economically incentivized at the same time. The old ritual engine and the new profit engine interlock. The church normalized seasonal repetition. The market monetized it. The result is a season that can make people generous and miserable in the same breath. The competitor calls this mass entrainment. You don't need that word. You can call it what it is: synchronized demand. When 2 billion people are nudged to want similar things at similar times, factories scale accordingly. Shipping calendars harden, labor schedules tighten, inventory become prophecy. The system begins to treat human emotion like a predictable resource, something that can be forecasted, harvested, and converted into revenue. And once emotion is treated as a resource, the season becomes less about celebration and more about extraction. Then the ritual does its final trick. It ends. The lights come down, the songs stop, the magic evaporates. And many people feel what they're trained not to say out loud: relief, followed by emptiness. That emptiness is not a personal failure. It's a hangover. Because you just ran a marathon of performance, social, emotional, financial. You spent, you traveled, you hosted, you smiled, you tolerated, you remembered, you pretended. And now the culture looks at you in January and says, "New year, new you." This is where the machine shows its full sophistication. It doesn't just sell you December, it sells you the repair afterward. And that's where we go next. In the next part, we examine the January aftermath, not as motivational fluff, but as the predictable collapse that follows a synchronized ritual. We'll ask why resolutions fail so reliably, why exhaustion is mistaken for weakness, and how the system profits twice, once from draining you, and again from selling you the cure. The ritual doesn't end on December 25th. That's the lie you're trained to accept, so you don't notice the second half of the mechanism. The real ending is the crash. Because after weeks of synchronized performance, shopping, traveling, hosting, smiling, spending, remembering, you don't step into January refreshed. You step into it depleted. And depletion is a political condition. It's easier to steer a tired person than an alert one. It's easier to sell to someone who feels behind. It's easier to shame someone who's already ashamed. So when the culture says, "New year, new you," listen closely. That line isn't an inspirational quote. It's a handoff. December drains you. January recruits you into the next program. This is why the competitor script, for all its theatrical nonsense, accidentally lands on something psychologically real. People often can't tell where their desire ends and their obligation begins in late December. But they miss the more dangerous part. In early January, people can't tell where their exhaustion ends and their self-hatred begins. That confusion is profitable. Here's the cycle, stripped of romance. In December, you are pushed into a high output mode under the banner of warmth. You spend money you didn't plan, not because you're possessed, but because refusal carries social cost. You buy gifts because it's what you do. You travel because family. You show up because absence is punished by disappointment. You eat, drink, and stretch your schedule until your body starts running on adrenaline and sugar and obligation. Then the environment shifts overnight. The music stops. The lights dim. People go quiet. Work returns. Bills arrive. And suddenly, the same culture that demanded you perform generosity begins demanding you perform transformation. You're told the problem is you. You're told your body is wrong. Your habits are wrong. Your goals are too small. Your discipline is weak. You're offered a fresh identity at a price. Gym memberships, diet plans, productivity systems, reset programs, apps that promise they'll turn your scattered life into a clean dashboard. But what happened to you isn't mainly a willpower story. It's a recovery story. And the system survives by preventing recovery from being recognized as legitimate. Because if people admitted January is for recovery, not reinvention, a huge chunk of the New Year economy would shrink. If people said, "I'm tired because I just ran a ritual marathon," then the shame lever loses torque. Shame only works when people believe their exhaustion is a personal defect. So the machine reframes depletion as failure and then sells you the fix. This is the same structural move we've been tracing since Rome. Saturnalia gave you licensed inversion so you'd accept the real hierarchy afterward. December gives you licensed warmth so you'll accept the real extraction afterward. And January gives you licensed self-blame so you'll accept the next purchase afterward. The competitor throws around a viral statistic. 92% of people abandon resolutions by February, as if numbers alone prove a plot. But you don't need a dramatic percentage to understand the reality. Resolution culture is built on a cruel premise. It assumes the best moment to demand discipline is the moment after a social and financial drain. That's not wisdom. That's exploitation dressed as motivation. Because a healthy change requires stable energy. Stable energy requires sleep, routine, unpressured time, and the dignity to move slowly. January gives you none of that. January gives you debt, work, cold, and an identity hangover. You are forced back into normal life while your nervous system is still catching up from the performance season. And in that gap, between the person you performed in December and the person you're expected to become in January, you're vulnerable. Vulnerability is not mystical receptivity. It's a physiological fact. When you're tired, you reach for quick meaning. You reach for simple narratives. You reach for a plan that promises control. That's why fresh start messaging hits so hard. It offers a clean line through the mess. Start over. Become better. Fix yourself. But ask, fix yourself for whom? This is where political psychology bites. A population locked in cycles of seasonal self-reproach is easier to manage because it is busy fighting itself. People who blame themselves for structural exhaustion don't ask structural questions. They don't look at how the calendar is engineered, the year-end sprint, the consumer pressure, the social scripts, the economic drain. They look inward and conclude, "I'm weak." And that conclusion is the lock. A locked person buys compliance like a product. A locked person keeps showing up. A locked person repeats the cycle because repeating feels safer than resisting. And when resistance appears, it appears as guilt. If I don't do this, I'm a bad person. That's not your conscience speaking purely. That's the ritual's voice installed in your social brain. So here's the point where we stop treating this like a holiday and start treating it like a system. December synchronizes emotion. January monetizes the crash. The machine profits twice, once from the build-up and once from the repair. And the most revealing part is that nobody has to coordinate it like a secret society. This is not a cabal in robes. This is incentive structure. The market doesn't need occultism. It needs forecasting. It needs tradition to keep repeating. And it needs you too ashamed to step off the treadmill. Now we're close to the end of Act 2, and the big question is ready to be answered. But not yet. We've seen Rome's pressure valve. We've seen imperial meaning. We've seen the church's overwrite. We've seen the market's factory gospel. We've seen January's profitable guilt. So what's left? The part people hate most, complicity. Because the ritual isn't enforced only from above, it's enforced sideways. by friends, by family, by co-workers, by the fear of being excluded. The machine doesn't just extract money, it extracts silence. In the next part, we stop asking, "What is Christmas?" and start asking, "Who benefits from your nostalgia?" with receipts. Not anagrams, not quantum slogans, real beneficiaries, real mechanisms. And the moral cost, what you surrender every year, just to avoid being the one who ruins the magic. Here's the adult version of the question the competitor tried to ask, like a teenager with a Ouija board. If December reliably makes billions of people more emotional, more compliant, and more willing to spend, who benefits from that reliability? Not the elite as a foggy villain. Name the structures. Follow the incentives. Look for the people who don't need you to believe, only to participate. Start with the oldest beneficiary, the state. Rome didn't need everyone to worship the same God with the same sincerity. It needed predictability. It needed a population that gathered on command, felt on command, and treated the empire's story as the default weather of reality. You can argue about which festival touched which date, but the pattern is clear. Calendars are soft power. They convert time into obedience, because time is the one resource every citizen must spend. If the state can script how you spend your time, it can script what you consider normal. Then the church. The church's win wasn't stealing a holiday. Its win was inheriting a seasonal threshold and turning it into a standardized ritual apparatus that reproduced itself. It didn't need to chase every home with force. It built a weekly and yearly rhythm so the population would walk into the institution voluntarily. People call that community. Institutions call it retention. Now the modern beneficiary, the market. The market doesn't need your soul. It needs your attention, your wallet, your shame, and your time. And December is the best corridor to harvest all four because the culture has already marked it as sacred. Not sacred in the theological sense, sacred in the social sense. You are not allowed to treat it like an ordinary month. That's the key. A sacred period is a protected period. You are expected to behave differently. You are expected to prove affection. You are expected to show up. And once a society expects that, corporations can step in and sell you the tools to perform it. This is what nostalgia does inside a system. Nostalgia is not just memory. Nostalgia is a lever that pulls you backward into earlier versions of yourself, versions that were less capable of refusing. A child cannot say, "I'm not participating in the holiday economy." A child cannot set boundaries with family. A child cannot opt out of the story. And when December triggers childhood layers, songs, smells, lights, it quietly drags adult decision-making into a softer, older place. That softness is not evil, it's human. But here's the confrontational truth. Human softness is a resource. Systems learn to mine it. When you are nostalgic, you don't want a spreadsheet. You want coherence. You want a narrative where things make sense, where love can be proven, where the past can be touched again. And the market offers you exactly that, pre-packaged. Because pre-packaged meaning is easier to buy than to build. Every ornament is a receipt. Every gift is a proof of love token. Every photo is a public confession. See, I belong. The season rewards performance with social approval. It punishes refusal with awkwardness, disappointment, exclusion. That punishment matters more than any hidden ritual, because the real enforcement mechanism is social. The moment you try to step off the script, you discover what the script is made of, other people's know-how of making you feel guilty. The gentle threats. It's just once a year. The moral accusations. You're being selfish. The sentimental weapons. After everything we've done, the casual cruelty. Don't ruin it for the kids. Notice the structure. Your refusal is reframed as harm. That reframing is how rituals become compulsory without law. That's why calling it programming isn't entirely wrong. It's just misaimed. The programmer is not a demon. The programmer is the network of expectations that teaches you. It is safer to comply than to be the one who breaks continuity. Now, who profits from that? Everyone who sells continuity. Retail, yes, but also industries that orbit the season. Travel, food, entertainment, advertising, credit. The holiday economy is not merely sales. It is scheduling. It is logistics. It is a coordinated surge of demand that forces labor into narrower, harsher conditions. Peak season means overtime. Peak season means quotas. Peak season means mistakes punished harder because it's the holidays. Someone's joy is always paid for by someone else's fatigue. That's the moral cost the competitor's script avoids by talking about frequencies. Frequencies don't have bruises. Supply chains do. And yet, here's the twist that makes this story uncomfortable, because it doesn't allow you to outsource blame to villains. The beneficiaries are not only above you. Some of them are beside you. Some of them are you. Because the season also rewards people socially for being enforcers. The aunt who shames you into attending. The friend who mocks you for not gifting. The co-worker who pressures you to join. They aren't paid in money. They're paid in reassurance. Reassurance that the ritual still holds. That their version of family and meaning hasn't collapsed. And that's the doorway to the real ending of this story. If the state benefits from predictability, the church benefits from unity, and the market benefits from compelled performance. What keeps the machine running year after year isn't a hidden priesthood. It's participation enforced horizontally, the fear of not belonging. That is the true profit of December, not only the money, but the obedience you practice without calling it obedience. So now we enter the final stretch. Our big question: who steers the ritual and who profits when it becomes compulsory? Has one last answer, and it's the hardest to swallow. A ritual is steered by whoever can make non-participation feel dangerous. In the next part, we stop blaming institutions alone and look at the real spell. Complicity. How families, workplaces, and communities become the unpaid police of the calendar. How the ritual recruits you to enforce it on each other, so power can stay clean-handed while you do the dirty work. If you were hoping this ends with a villain in a robe, you're going to hate the next sentence. The strongest enforcement mechanism of Christmas is not the church, not the state, not the market. It's other people, and the part of you that is terrified of losing them. This is why the competitor script can get away with nonsense like ancient frequency engineering. It gives you an enemy outside yourself. It lets you feel awake without having to feel implicated. But history is nastier. History says, systems endure when ordinary people become their unpaid staff. Look at how ritual is actually policed. No government agent knocks on your door to make you buy gifts. No bishop drags you to a dinner table. No CEO personally forces you to play carols in your car. The pressure arrives through softer channels: family expectation, workplace norms, social media performance, the fear of being seen as cold, the fear of being labeled ungrateful. And because that pressure is emotional, it bypasses the part of you that wants to argue facts. This is where tradition becomes a weapon. Tradition is framed as inheritance. If you refuse, you are not merely changing behavior, you are betraying memory. You are insulting the dead. You are breaking continuity. You are ruining it for the kids. That last phrase is the cleanest knife. It turns your boundary into cruelty. It turns your self-protection into harm. So, you comply. Not because you're brainwashed, because you are human in a social species, and exclusion hurts more than debt. Now notice what that means for our big question. Who steers the ritual? It's not just the people who fund ads or print calendars. The steering wheel is distributed. It's held by anyone who can punish non-participation, even with a look. The family table is an institution. It has rules. It has hierarchies. It has old roles waiting like costumes. You arrive, and suddenly you're not an adult with choices. You're the child version of yourself who learned what good looks like in that house. You revert. You defer. You make yourself smaller. You perform. And the cruel joke is that everyone else is doing the same thing at the same time in millions of homes. That's why the season feels like a wave. Not because of quantum fields, because synchronized social scripts create synchronized behavior. The script says, go home, be kind, spend money, smile. Don't start fights. Don't bring politics. Don't bring pain. Make it nice. Nice is the ritual's censorship tool. Because if you were allowed to be honest, if the season allowed grief to stay in the room, allowed resentment to be spoken, allowed lonely people to admit they're lonely, you would see the machine. You would see how much work it takes to keep the performance believable. But the season teaches the opposite. Discomfort is a moral failure. If you feel bad, you're doing it wrong. So people conceal. They drink. They joke. They force cheer. They call it spirit. And once concealment becomes sacred, the ritual can carry anything. It can carry abuse. It can carry coercion. It can carry the quiet violence of families that only gather to reenact old wounds. This is where horrifying events belong in this story. Not because Christmas is inherently evil, but because ritual is where societies hide their contradictions. The same month that sells peace can be the month domestic violence spikes, the month loneliness becomes lethal, the month debt becomes panic. The public story is warmth. The private reality, for many, is survival. And the system doesn't collapse under that contradiction because the people living inside it are trained to keep it invisible. That is complicity, not wickedness, but participation without naming the cost. Now let's make it sharper. The market's role is obvious. Ads, discounts, seasonal product launches, but the market can't force meaning. Only communities can do that. The market piggybacks on meaning that already exists. It sells you the tools to love because you fear being judged for not loving hard enough. So your neighbors become the enforcement arm. Your relatives become the auditors. Social media becomes the courtroom. Everyone posts the tree, the gifts, the dinner, the matching pajamas, because public proof reduces anxiety. You don't post to brag, you post to reassure yourself that you did it correctly, that you belong. And then those posts become the new norm, raising the bar for everyone else. One family's performance becomes another family's shame. Shame becomes spending. Spending becomes debt. Debt becomes stress. Stress becomes silence. Silence becomes more performance next year. The cycle is social before it is economic. This is why opting out feels impossible. Because opting out isn't just refusing purchases. It's refusing membership terms. It's saying, I will not pay this tribute for inclusion. And human beings are trained from childhood to fear that move, because the oldest terror in a social species is being left outside in the cold. So here's the brutal truth that resolves most of the competitors' mystical claims. Rituals control people not because they are ancient, but because they are social contracts enforced by belonging. Once you understand that, the question becomes solvable. Not, how do I escape an occult spell? But, how do I renegotiate a social contract without burning my life down? That is Act 3. That is where this story has been heading. In the final part, we answer the big question directly. Who steers the ritual, who profits, and what freedom actually looks like when you stop lying to yourself. Not a hermit life, not rejection. A reclaimed ritual, one you choose, one that doesn't require debt or performance, one that can hold truth instead of censorship. Because the only real power you have over the calendar is this. You can refuse to be forced into a version of yourself you no longer consent to be. So here is the answer to the big question we opened with. No anagrams, no demons, no frequencies, no mystical fog. A society's rituals are steered by whoever can fund their repetition, broadcast their meaning, and punish non-participation, socially, economically, or spiritually. And the ones who profit are the ones who convert that repetition into stability, authority, and spending. Rome profited in order. The state learned that scheduled celebration could manage pressure, and that symbolic rebirth could stabilize loyalty. The church profited in unity. It inherited a winter corridor already saturated with fear and longing and redirected it into institutional rhythm, mass, calendars, community discipline. Modern capitalism profits in extraction. It doesn't need you to believe. It needs you to perform. Because performance produces purchases, and purchases keep the system fed. That's the diagnosis. Now comes the hard part. What do you do with it without turning into a paranoid exile from your own culture? Because the competitor ends with conscious participation protocols. And for once that instinct is not completely wrong. The mistake is the framing. They treat awareness like a shield against magic. It's not magic. It's social mechanics. So the exit isn't escape the ritual. The exit is reclaim authorship. Reclaiming authorship means you stop confusing tradition with obligation. You stop letting other people's nostalgia write invoices for your life. You decide what December means in your house, in your body, in your budget, without asking permission from a market, an algorithm, or a relative who confuses guilt with love. And yes, this is where it gets confrontational, because the most effective control system is the one that convinces you you have no choices. You do. They're just expensive in the currency power structures hate most: discomfort. Because the first price of freedom is being willing to disappoint people who benefit from your compliance. That's why the exit must be grounded. If you try to quit Christmas, you will probably fail. Not because you're weak, but because ritual is a shared environment. You can't avoid streets, stores, co-workers, school calendars. Total refusal is socially punishing. So don't aim for purity. Aim for sovereignty. Sovereignty begins with naming, not demon, naming what's actually happening. When nostalgia hits, don't treat it as truth. Treat it as weather, a seasonal front moving through your nervous system. It can be beautiful and still not be an instruction. You can feel warmth without obeying the marketplace's script of how warmth must be expressed. When guilt hits, I should buy more, I should travel, I should host, I should prove I care. Label it as social pressure, not morality. Moral action is chosen freely. Action under guilt is tribute. That distinction is the first cut that breaks the spell. Now the practical architecture, how you reclaim the ritual without rejecting it. First, choose your symbols deliberately. Ritual works through repetition and symbolism. Fine. Then don't let corporations choose your symbols by flooding you with theirs. Pick 1 to 3 elements that genuinely anchor you. Maybe a meal, maybe a walk at night, maybe a single song, maybe a small tree, maybe a candle. Then, let the rest pass like noise. Your life is not required to be a themed set. Second, cap the tribute. Set a budget that is not a performance but a boundary. A boundary is not negotiable with shame. If someone tries to shame you for it, that is information, not about your generosity, but about their need to control the script. In a healthy relationship, love is not audited through spending. Third, turn the season's belonging into actual belonging. If you're going to gather, gather for truth, not theatre. Make space for grief. Make space for loneliness. Make space for people who don't have perfect families. The machine relies on nice to keep costs invisible. Your exit relies on honesty to make costs shared. Fourth, reclaim the solstice without mysticism. Not because the cosmos is casting a spell, because it's a real threshold in the year, and thresholds are psychologically useful. Sit in darkness for 10 minutes. No phone, no shopping list. Ask one question. What did I trade this year to belong? And what am I no longer willing to pay? That is the honest ritual modern life avoids, because it produces citizens who can renegotiate contracts. Fifth, refuse the January handoff. When the culture sells you the New Year fix, recognizes it as the second harvest. Recovery is not failure. Rest is not weakness. Don't sign a contract with your shame. Make one small practice that returns you to yourself. Sleep, walking, budgeting, boundaries. Something that strengthens agency instead of selling you another identity to perform. Now, a warning, because this is where most people flinch. When you renegotiate the ritual, some people will accuse you of ruining it. They'll say you're negative, selfish, bitter, too serious. That is the ritual defending itself through human mouths. It is the system's immune response. Shame the dissenter so everyone else doesn't start thinking. But the point of this story is not to hate Christmas. The point is to stop lying about what holds it together. Christmas holds because it is a shared calendar loaded with meaning. Meaning becomes power when it is compulsory. Compulsion becomes profit when it is monetized. And none of it requires a secret cult. It requires something much more ordinary and therefore much more dangerous. Human beings enforcing belonging terms on each other. So, let the final line be simple. You were never controlled by Satan in the letters of Santa. You were controlled by a system that taught you that refusing the script is worse than debt, worse than exhaustion, worse than resentment. And the moment you stop believing that, truly stop, something changes. Not the calendar, not the weather, not the holiday lights. You change. You stop being fuel. You become an author. And that is the only freedom that actually exists inside a shared ritual. The freedom to choose what you will repeat and to refuse what you will no longer pay for, even if the world calls your refusal ungrateful. Because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. And if you listen, they don't ask you to fear December. They ask you to stop surrendering yourself to it.